Okay, we're streaming. Church without walls, but I say to you. Welcome to Church Without Walls. I'm John, and this is
Peyton.
And today is our last day in our temporary studio. This is my wife's dining room table, and this is our great room. So the dining family room with my ukulele wall in the back, and we've been here almost 2 years now. And it was supposed to just be a couple of weeks. So this is Peyton and I saying thank you, Mom, for being patient with us.
Well, at least we got to watch TV while we ate, since we had to eat in the TV room. Instead of being in here.
Anyway, we'll be in our new studio next week. We converted our one-car garage into our studio, affectionately known as the Sparrow's Nest, and we'll be there next week. So this is our last week here, and we wanted to make it special. So Peyton is going to do some special artwork at the easel you see behind me that Lotso is affectionately guarding. And I want to speak to you about the most important lesson that Jesus ever taught. Is that Hagrid?
Yeah.
Is that
My
a
mini
Lego
version
Hagrid?
of you,
All right.
since I don't have a you doll.
So
Supposed to
that
be mom.
more right after this. All right. So while Peyton gets to getting behind me, this is like a really cool angle. I can't believe you waited till the last week to do this because it looks really cool. It's almost Bob Ross-like. You know what I mean? Are you going to draw like happy little trees and stuff?
The cutout I have, it'd be impossible.
One of the things that really bothers me, and we're going to use Albert Brooks and John Gottman today to help us teach a lesson that Jesus tried to teach 2,000 years ago that the church still hasn't really gotten right, and I haven't, and most likely you haven't, at least not consistently. But to do that, I want to start with something that's really a burr under my saddle lately, and it's modern Christian apologetics. I think really is getting it wrong and is turning people away. It's actually doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do, which apologetics is supposed to show a world full of despair and doubt, the hope that is within us. And I think it's become distracted, and it's filled with a little bit of rage and a little bit of fear and a whole lot of insecurity. And it's tone deaf. And one of the ways it's tone deaf, and if you're on social media, you see this all the time with popular apologists who are online. But one of the ways I think it's tone deaf, the major way I think it's tone deaf, is it's as that church in Revelation who Christ chides, they have forgotten their first love. And they're very busy and they're very about a lot of things, but they've forgotten the primary reason that we exist. And I'll say it this way. Time after time, I go online and I see Christian apologists mocking atheists. And they're straw-manning atheist arguments. And they will post a quote from an atheist, oftentimes taken out of context, and then they will mock his intellect and say, what an idiot and what a dope, and all their fanboys chime in underneath, whether it's Richard Dawkins or Aaron Ra or Paul Ogia or any Christopher Hitchens or these other famous atheists, Penn Jillette. And Christians think that their defense of the gospel includes mocking these people, mocking their intelligence, ridiculing them, pointing out that they're not logical, and so forth. And the reason I say it's straw manning is because they never do that. They never self-police. So rarely do you see these same apologists criticizing something ridiculous that's said by a Christian. And trust me, there's a lot of that going on, and it's not just Pat Robertson. It's professing Christians in government, in politics, that say ridiculous things. It's teaching pastors or spiritual leaders, and you could just make a living out of posting crazy, bat crap crazy things that Christians say. And yet these apologists ignore that, and so it becomes a tribal war, us against them. And I think it's a breach of Christ's first commandment. And it's not love the Lord your God. I think they think they're doing that. It's love your neighbor as yourself. And why do I call that the first commandment? Stick with us. But I also think that from a social studies understanding, from a social science understanding, it's uniquely flawed. And so it's, even from a pragmatist understanding, it's turning people away. So, if you write a book about how to attract the opposite sex or something, how to get a date or something, and you have 10 steps in how to get a date, and you've spent 40 years and you've never gotten a date, don't hang your shingle up as the next hitch, because eventually you have to kind of take an accounting as to how effective it is. If you open a new restaurant and no one ever comes, if you build it and they don't come, eventually you have to take an accounting and say, maybe I'm doing this wrong. And this is apart from saying, what would Christ think of my ministry? Does it fit the fundamentals of what he taught? And I don't think it does. And let's start with this. Let's start with what I say unto you. So Jesus did some radical things, and it's not surprising that the religious people of his days picked up stones. But I heard Paul Logia, who is a Christian, former Christian, now celebrity atheist on YouTube. I heard him make a comment that I thought was incorrect, and so I have a lot of respect for Paul Logia. But he said that, trying to say that Jesus wasn't that radical, he said that, basically the greatest thing Jesus ever said was the golden rule, and it wasn't original to him. It predates Jesus, which that has a lot of truth in it. The golden rule does predate Jesus and even Judaism, and it's found in other cultures earlier. And it's almost a universal acceptance of understanding that, treat others as you would have them treat you. And yet it's the start of Paul Logia's statement that I contest, that I take issue with, when he says the greatest thing Jesus ever said was the golden rule. I don't think it was. I think most people even most secular historians who look at Jesus and his ministry, don't point to the golden rule as the most prominent thing he said or the most influential thing they said. I think it's virtually almost universal to point to the Sermon on the Mount, which is where we're going to go today, and we're going to start with that. And it's Matthew 5, a passage in Matthew 5 that I want to share with you today. And it is the following, using the Tree of Life version. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, I'm going to come back and forth to this, but let's just start with how radical that was. Jesus is teaching to a bunch of Jews. This is a Jewish audience on the Judean hill, and he's saying, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Basically, he's quoting Moses. This is Leviticus, right? Is it 17 or so? Somewhere around there. 17 or 20, I always get those confused, but love your neighbor. He's quoting Moses. You've heard it said, and the prophets who may have, paraphrased Moses. And somehow it got twisted into love your neighbor and hate your enemy, and that stuck somehow, right? And then the really radical nature of what Jesus is teaching here comes with the next statement. So it's this, but I Just stop there. That's going to get devout Jews to pick up stones, because here he's setting himself apart from Moses. He's basically saying Moses didn't go far enough. That was preschool. I'm going to take you into, college. That was arithmetic. Now comes the calculus. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, who the heck is this guy? This is Joseph's son, right? The carpenter's son? Who the hell is he to correct Moses? Right? Don't we know his brethren, his brothers and sisters? This guy, he's not an angel from heaven. This is the carpenter's son. And he's fronting Moses here. He's trying to suggest that Moses take a back seat to him. You could see the anger that would bring up in people, no matter what he said. But he goes on and he says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Now stop here for a second. Who were the enemies of this audience? They were pagans. They were the occupying Romans. They were the Gentiles that came through, the marketplace. They were the defiled of the world. They weren't the apple of God's eye. We all know that Israel was the apple of God's eye, that they were the chosen people. And now this carpenter's son is telling us that we should love our oppressor. How do you think that language would have worked in the last election cycle, or the previous one to that? I don't know. We live in a world that is so polarized right now, and Christians played such a huge role in the polarization here in this country that it's really inspired a flurry of books in the likes of Jesus and John Wayne, which shows this Christian nationalism movement that I used to be a part of, by the way. So I'm not guilty. I have blood on my hands. But this idea that we've added to the gospel, this red, white, and blue, this idea that America is now the chosen nation and the elect nation, and in that we've really embraced the part about hating our enemies, loving our friends and hating our enemies. We really embrace that, because for years, if you listen to talk radio or evangelical pulpits, you'll find out that the real problem with America are, the liberals, and sometimes mentioned by name, like Hillary and Nancy Pelosi, and these are the true enemies, right? The liberals, the Muslims are enemies, right? Especially post 9/11. The radical gays, the alphabet mafia, these are the enemies, and we should, put a crosshairs on them and defeat them in the name of the Lord. And this teaching of Jesus to love our enemies got kind of pushed to the back of the bus. And I think many of us would probably have picked up stones if somebody went on Fox News and said this. I think we'd want their head on a platter. I think if they were our congressmen, we'd vote them out. I think if they were our pastor, we'd walk away. I heard Sky Dechani on the Holy Post podcast this week interviewing Kristen Kobes-Dumez on her book, Jesus Sent John Wayne. And he said when he was a pastor, he finally came to the conclusion that his evangelical flock really wasn't influenced by what was coming from the pulpit, but they were more influenced by what was coming from their news outlet, from their source of news, which more than likely was Fox News. And I was driving in my car when I heard this on the podcast. I turned to my son Connor and I said, bingo, that was my experience, And I say that, with a great deal of remorse, as I led a flock for many years as a Christian nationalist. And I I'd quote this verse. I thought it was a remarkable verse. It's simple to understand. If people asked me a question about Jesus' radical teaching, I'd mention this verse, but I didn't live it. I didn't practice it. I didn't love my enemies. You know, I made excuses to justify my attitude toward my enemies. And I was much closer to the Jews in the day of the Lord that hated the Romans and that were looking for a Messiah to throw them off, to destroy them. And it took me a while to see this in myself. But Christ says, you shall love your enemies. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Here's the connection here. If you are really, right, reflecting the image of your Father in heaven, you will love your enemies and you will pray for those who persecute you. After all, does he not cause his sun to rise on both the evil and the good? Does he not send his rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous? Now, they were an agricultural society, so both sunshine and rain were necessary. In our society, we kind of don't care for rain because we're much less agricultural than we used to be. So it's like rain will spoil our plans, or rain would ruin our wedding, or something. But rain was a blessing in that sense. So both of these things were a blessing in that verse, that God sends his rain, his sunshine and his rain, the very things that help us, our economy, that build our economy, that help us live, that nourish our lives, that bring flourishing to our community. God gracefully gives this to all. He's not partial. This, by the way, contradicts a lot of Leviticus as well. See, Jesus here is contradicting Leviticus 26, as Job did before him. The book of Job and Leviticus do not cohere. They're two different teachings. Leviticus is a prosperity gospel. The book of Proverbs is a prosperity gospel. This is why Joel Osteen and people like him quote Leviticus and Proverbs. And this is why Jesus and Paul and Job and Jeremiah confront the prosperity gospel. So if you're still thinking that God wrote the Bible and that there aren't differing opinions in the Bible, I still say you haven't really read the Bible, because it's not a book, it's a library, and there were differing opinions in there. So Jesus here is confronting Leviticus. He's confronting Moses, and he's saying, you've gotten one story, but here's the story you've missed, and this is the story, not just of me, right? I tell you, but of my Father in heaven. If you really wanted to carry out the Father's will, here it is. Not just love your neighbor. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Now stop for a second here. I want you to picture something. I want you to picture Moses writing the commandments, right? And whether they're 613, why don't we just boil them down to 10, right? When Moses boiled down the law from 613 to 10, he was given his Cliff's Notes version, right? And so he gives the 10, right? Now you could picture a big wall with 613 commandments on it. And a guy with a white beard and a staff walks out there with an eraser. And he erases, 603 of them. So there's 10. The 10. And the 10 start with love your Lord your God, right? And don't fashion idols, and love your neighbor as yourself. All right. So here we have 10, and love's in there somewhere right at the start. And then Jesus comes along here on the Sermon on the Mount, and actually in a different place, Jesus will erase 8 of these. When he's asked by a lawyer, what's the greatest commandment? What are the greatest commandments? He gives 2: love your Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, earlier in his ministry. But eventually he gives 1. And Paul sees that, right? And Paul boils it down to 1. So Jesus erases 8, and you might say even erases 9, but Paul definitely erases 9. Because when Paul is asked what's the fulfillment of the law, he doesn't even bring up love of God. He just says, love your neighbor as yourself. But Jesus takes the love of the neighbor to be inclusive of that which the Jew would not consider a neighbor. And Paul did it as well. If you didn't see it, when Paul says there's no Jew or Gentile, then everyone's your neighbor. Jesus does this by saying, love your enemies. Love those outside of your tribe, of your faith, of your ethnicity, of your comfort zone. My question to you is, does your church do that well? Do you do that well? Does your tribe of faithful do that well? And I think this is a question we must constantly ask ourselves. Does your favorite Christian apologist do that well? Does he love Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens? And believe me, I'm not saying you can't confront their philosophies or their errors. I just confronted Paul Logia's, but I did it respectfully without attacking the man or ridiculing his intelligence. These people are highly intelligent. They're articulate. And guess what? God loves them. And Christ died for them. And they are the very brothers whom we should be keepers of. They are the younger brothers in the far country. And we don't persuade anyone in the room when we take people that our audience reveres and we mock and ridicule them and we cherry pick stupid things that they might have said in or out of context, and we ignore those things that the people wearing our jerseys have said or done. And you see this in politics all the time, right? You see people making fun of Joe Biden's slip-ups and making fun of him being, senile. But nobody really who does that confronts the crazy things that Donald Trump said. You see it in the political world all the time. And you saw it the other way, too. You saw people mocking Ronald Reagan's intelligence and saying he was senile. You saw people mocking George W. Bush intelligence in relation to Senator Kerry when they ran against each other. So this is commonplace in the world, in politics, but it should not be commonplace to the people of God. Not if you're reflecting the Father in heaven. It shouldn't even be spoken of. And it shouldn't be the leaders of our so-called apologetics where we're trying to earn a hearing with people. We should have a different tone, and the tone should be one of love and acceptance and a good listener and somebody who could respond to error but do so with empathy and compassion and reason. You've heard it said that you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I think a lot of American Christians would rewrite that and say, but I tell you, crush your enemies. Crush your enemies. And that's why they look for people to crush your enemies. So, but Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Of course, Jesus wasn't out for political expedience. This is why he'd be hated today in America. Jesus would be utterly hated today by American evangelicals, run out of the church, called a liberal. He would have been called a liberal. He would have been called anti-Bible or not an inerrantist because he's attacking the Bible. His words attack what is clearly written in the Bible. And he's putting himself above the Bible, which he did many a time, by the way. But can you imagine that in modern pulpits? When the Bible has been elevated to the fourth member of the Godhead or some kind of equal nature as Jesus, when Jesus time and time again challenged the Bible of his day, when he'd say to the scribes and the Pharisees, you search the scriptures because you think you can find life in them. And he's saying you can't find life in them. In the contrast, he's saying, but you will not come to me, where true life resides. Here, not on the parchment. So anyway, here, this is the most revolutionary thing that Christ preached. And it's not popular, not because the church today reflects Nietzsche more than reflects Jesus Christ. But let me get through the saying and then bring in Gottman. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? All right, so you love your family. So you love your church family. Somebody said to my wife recently, "Oh, we have love in our in this group I'm in. You should see the love in the church." Okay, sure. I'm sure you all love each other. You all speak the same language. You know the secret handshake. You dress the same. You worship the same. You pray the same. You sing the same. So how do you love your neighbors even? How do you love your enemies? Don't tell me how you love your own, because Jesus rebuked that here. He says even the evil, look what he says, even the evil love their own. For if you love those who love you, what reward is that? You don't get a gold star for that. I mean, why do you think that's honorable? Even the tax collectors do the same, don't they? The tax collectors wasn't just the IRS in the day of Christ. They were the traitors, the betrayers. They were Jewish people who worked for the Romans to fleece the Jews, separate the Jews from their money and give it to the Romans. They helped propagate the oppression that the people wanted to put down. They were like camp guards. They were like the Jewish police in the ghettos in Poland. So they got some special favors from the Nazis. This is how contemptible they were held in the day of Christ. And Jesus says what? Even the tax collectors do that. Why are you proud of that? Even the traitors do that, don't they? And by the way, this is supposedly written by one of those traitors. It must have been very humbling for Matthew to write down these words, because he was a tax collector and he was chosen by Jesus to be a disciple. Even the tax collectors do the same, don't they? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than anyone else? Even the pagans do that, don't they? Therefore, be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. This is the most revolutionary teaching of Christ. If I was ever called to a pastorate again, first of all, my wife would have a heart attack. But I would take it. I'd take it for 1 week. I would have one message, and I'd walk into the church, and I would set up on the pulpit the passage that says, love your enemies as yourself. And I'd say, this is the first lesson. And when we have accomplished this, let's meet again. And I'd walk off the stage and retire, because I'm not an idealist. I know that this side of heaven, that's going to be a lifelong effect. But you don't need to study the Bible verse by verse and chapter by chapter, because we haven't gotten the most important thing right. Jesus Christ, his Bible was the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. And when he was asked to boil it all down, he boiled it down to this. When Paul was asked to boil down the fulfillment of the law, he boiled it down to love your neighbor. Not be able to discern when the church started and if the 12 are part of the body, or when is the rapture going to take place, if it is going to take place, or you know, how many, as my father used to say, how many buttons on the Antichrist overshoe. You don't need that, right? People want to become expert in this. They want to become expert in this, and they have no love. They want to be drummers on garbage cans. They want to be what the Apostle Paul calls a cacophony. Some people dig into this so much because they want to dodge the main thing, because they find it hard to love their enemies, because they find it hard to love their neighbors. There's a pastor from Moody who once counseled a couple because their marriage was failing. And in a moment of brutal honesty, the man said to the pastor about his wife, who wasn't in the room at the time, I can't love her. I hate her. I despise her. She's an ugly person. And it's over. And the pastor said to him, well, if you can't love her as Christ loved the church, because that's what husbands are called to do. He said, no, I can't do that. I just don't have it in me. He said, well, if you can't love her as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it, maybe you can love her as your neighbor. Can you merely start there, and we'll build from that platform? And he thought about it for a second. He said, she'd be the worst neighbor I've ever had. I can't even love her as a neighbor. And then the pastor, with unique and cutting wisdom, said, well, if you can't love her as Christ loved the church and you can't love her as your neighbor, then at least love her as Christ calls us to love our enemies. You see, there's no rebuttal to that. You either do or you don't. You either reflect the Father in carrying out the will of Christ, or you just abandon it and don't. But don't call yourself Christian after that. Don't proclaim the Lord's name in vain. This is how the Lord's house loves. Like this. And if you don't do it, then don't embarrass the name. My wife just finished a novel by Nicholas Sparks, and she showed me some of the last paragraphs in it. I don't know the name of the novel, one of his latest novels. Personally, I think he only wrote one. I think he's a one-hit wonder. I think he could have just ended his career after The Notebook, but he's living on the fumes of The Notebook, in my opinion. But anyway, this was some profound stuff that she showed me from this last book. She showed me a few paragraphs from the ending, and it's a woman who's talking, and she's talking about love and the love that her father loved her with. And she came to realize, she said that love without acceptance really isn't truly unconditional love. She's talking about the sacrifice that her father went to love her, even in her worst moments, and to accept her even in her worst moments. And my wife at the time, she said, this is unconditional love. This is what I feel when I read, "Come to me, all who are weary, and find rest in me." This is the love that you must have known when the father falls on the dirty neck of the prodigal and covers him in kisses and blessing. Not because he's proud that he just won a Timothy Award in Awana, but because his son was dead and is alive, because his son was lost and now is found, and he's where he should be, in the arms of the Father. This is how we are called to love. Now, the question isn't, does your church do that? Because you're going to say, yeah, your church does that. Just like everyone who's ever interviewed, they all say, they all say Congress is awful, but they like their local congressman. Or they all say the public schools all stink, but their public school's an exception. Yeah, you've heard this time and again, and all the churches suck except the church I attend. And so you're going to defend your church, but the question isn't what you think of your church. The question is what your unbelieving neighbor thinks of it. Do they feel welcome? Do they feel rest? Do they feel loved? Quite honestly, if I was an unbeliever, if I was an atheist, and I read the words of the celebrated Christian apologists of our day, I would not feel love. I'd feel disdain and ridicule and mockery. And I'd feel actually the insecurity behind all that. I've got some acquaintances online. We're parts of the same group, and they can't get through a week without posting a meme that's negative about atheists, that's making fun of atheists, or making fun of the way they understand their world, or making fun of a certain thing they've said on occasion. And I can't help but think, this is not a ministry. This is not a testimony. This is Christian FU. This is how Christians flip the bird to their younger brother in the field. This is more of the elder son gripping, right, thinking he's doing the Father's work, but you're the very reason the little brother left. Your hypocrisy, your self-righteousness, your tone-deaf ear is the very reason that you can't earn a hearing with somebody who actually thinks Richard Dawkins is pretty smart, or Christopher Hitchens has a point, or Paul Logie is more honest than Mike Winger. Peyton, how you doing back there?
Almost done.
Okay, I want to talk to you about a couple things before we go. And one of them is this. This became a New York Times bestseller. How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt. And it's called Love Your Enemies. And is it by Franklin Graham? No. Is it by Pastor Jeffers or Jerry Falwell Jr.? No. Is it by William Lane Craig or Mike Winger? No. It's by a social scientist, a journalist named Arthur C. Brooks. It's called Love Your Enemies. He takes the pinnacle teaching of Christ to write a book that is basically Christianity 101. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's not that the world isn't hungry for the message of Christ. It's just that the world knows how to package it better than the church does. And I hate to say this, the church doesn't reflect the Father above. Not today. Not here and now. Not in the West, at least. Maybe in a couple instances, in a few churches in America, and Celebrate Recoveries. Certainly in churches around the world, yes, I'm not denying any of that. But as far as the American church goes, in a cohesive view of it, if Paul was writing in a letter to it, or Jesus was writing a letter to it, or your neighbor was describing it, no, love wouldn't come up in the top 5 characteristics. It would be judgmental, it would be hypocritical, it would be anti-science. I could keep going. It would be insecure because they don't allow questions or doubt. Yet Arthur C. Brooks writes this book, Love Your Enemies, basically using the Sermon on the Mount to say that we can disagree without being disagreeable. That we can actually love our enemies and still try and change their minds and change their trajectory with the love of, well, he doesn't say with the love of Christ, but he's arguing it. Now, where does he get this idea? There's a very important word in the subtitle. How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt. We live in a rage society where we've made it very hard to love your enemy, both from the pulpit and from the news desk. We've made it very easy to hate them, to not trust them, to blame them, to point our fingers at them. You know, John Gottman is brilliant, and if you haven't read his books on marriage, I highly recommend it. But he's pretty much the top scholar when it comes to modern marriage. And he developed a series of questions, took less than 15 minutes, when he'd meet with a couple who was having difficulty. Within 15 minutes, to an 80-degree accuracy, he could tell whether they'd be divorced in the next 5 years or not by how they responded to these certain questions. Well, that would have saved the people a lot of time, money, and despair, right? Just be interviewed by Gottman for 15 minutes, and he says, no, 80% says, no, you ain't going to make it. Just end it now, walk away now. But the thing about his study is, if you read it, his study showed that it wasn't couples that fought or even fought with passion with each other that ended up divorced. That wasn't the sign. If he pointed to a single sign, it was this word contempt. Contempt. If they disagreed with each other and contempt was present, it's already over. There's virtually almost no hope for reconciliation or healing. And yet, there were some very successful couples that had been married 50 years, who had very vociferous arguments still. And yet they found a way that they could argue even vehemently and disagree without holding each other in contempt, without dehumanizing one another and making the other person a monster for thinking differently. So just taking Arthur C. Brooks and John Gottman, we have a better understanding of what Christ was teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, which prompted a 1970s psychologist to say, all of modern psychology are but footnotes to the Sermon on the Mount. So I respectfully disagree with Paul Ogia when he says that Jesus' most revolutionary teaching was the Golden Rule. No, it goes way beyond treat others as you'd like to be treated yourself. It goes way beyond that on the Sermon on the Mount. And it made holy men of old want to pick up stones and kill a rabbi or drag him to a Roman magistrate to have him crucified. And it caused wicked men to lay stones down. This is the revolutionary nature of Jesus Christ. And we can harness it again in the church if we shed our distractions, if we shed the nonsense that we picked up along the way and added to the gospel. If we walk away from short-term ideas of what it means to have triumph. If we remember once again that we are not ambassadors of the United States, but we are ambassadors of heaven on the planet Earth. George Shultz, a cabinet member of the late Ronald Reagan, often told stories about how he would interview diplomats prior to them being named as an ambassador to certain countries around the world. And he'd invite them into his office, and prominently displayed in front of his desk would be a globe. And he would nod to the globe and ask the young diplomat, so what's your country that you're going, what's your country on that globe? And oftentimes people would spin to Ireland, point to Ireland or Japan if they'd just been appointed to be ambassador to Japan or ambassador to Ireland. And Schultz would shake his head and correct them there because he wanted them to be crystal clear. And he'd say, no, you're an ambassador to Japan. But your country is the United States. Don't ever forget that. This is the very same conversation that the coach had with the U.S. team and the Miracle team, the hockey team that defeated the Soviets. When in the locker room he'd say, who do you play for? And somebody would say Boston College, and somebody would say a different college, and he'd say, no, you play for the USA. This is the kind of thinking that we need to instill again as followers of Jesus Christ. I don't belong to this lesser tribe. I don't serve a lesser God that's actually a demon. You can't add arsenic to the baby's milk and expect nourishing. And we've allowed that to come in. We've allowed idols to displace the person of Christ and his will. And the very pinnacle of his teaching is to love your enemies. And it's not easy, and it's not hard, and it's certainly not filled with pleasure. If you've ever tried to do this, it comes with a cost. And sadly, sometimes these enemies that we're to love are members of our own church community. Even sadder still, sometimes they're members of our own family. Sposy, how are we looking?
I just need to put this much at the top.
So one more time, I highly recommend this book by Arthur C. Brooks, Love Your Enemies. It is geared toward the current milieu that is the American predicament. This idea that, somehow, as Christians, if we're fighting the good fight, we must hate our neighbors, and somehow we blame them for everything. It's the liberals, it's the gays, it's the Muslims, it's the environmentalists, it's the Marxists, it's the socialists, it's the Democrats, or if you're on the other side of it and you're a social justice Christian, then it's the conservatives, or it's the fundamentalists, or it's the capitalists that are the fault of everything. I love what G.K. Chesterton understood when a newspaper in his day asked him in an editorial, asked actually all of England to write in and let them know what they felt was wrong with the world. Chesterton, who you knew was a very articulate man, and some might even say long-winded, wrote back a very short reply to that question, what is wrong with the world? I am. And the irony of that I am is it's in humility, in great contradistinction to the I am of Jesus. And it's in that friction of his I am and our I am that we find wisdom and that we find enough love to live out the pinnacle of Christ's teaching, to remove the log in our eye before we speak about the splinter in our neighbors, to love our neighbor even if he is our enemy. And more importantly, when Jesus says love your neighbor, he's not talking about some elusive emotion that nobody knows about. The neighbor should feel the love as the prodigal felt it. There was no question about it in the prodigal's mind. Not when his shoes and his feet were shod. Not when he was wearing the best coat. Not when the servants were slaying the fatted calf and setting the table. Not when the father, in all his dignity and regal nature, is covering him with kisses. And by the way, that attitude, if our churches displayed that attitude, when my wife said that verse, come to me all ye who are weary and who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest, that should be how the lost look at the church. You know, if you watch the old gangster movies, with Bogart and Cagney, think of you will of the Catholic Church, but back then, the Catholic Church, this is before all the scandals and all that nature took place, and they're real, and I know they brought a great deal of hurt, and there was a great deal of hurt back in the 30s and the 20s and the 40s. But if you look back at those gangster movies, oftentimes at the end of the movie, somebody's dying on the church steps, right? They were going to the church, whether it be for absolution or for some kind of comfort. Even in Angels with Dirty Faces, Rocky responds to the call of the Father and does a sacrificial thing at the end of that movie, to his own detriment, by the way, to the detriment of his own reputation, his own legacy. It would be nice if the church was seen again as a place of refuge like it was in the time of Quasimodo and Esmeralda, where the church was actually a buffer against the state and not a bedfellow. Well, just thoughts on a dreary Sunday morning in Phoenix, an overcast day. I'm done, Poe. We need you.
I'm just finished.
You're just finished. You're going to come sit by me. You want me to hold it up?
Sure.
And you explain it? Ooh, it's kind of Rembrandt colors
I think
today.
there's a second. Now it's just like paper.
All right. What do we got?
It's a sunset.
Oh, the sunset, huh? It really set. It must have set like 5 minutes ago. But go ahead, Rembrandt. What else we got?
A waterfall.
Mm-hmm.
And a mountain.
Uh-huh.
And a tree. And some grass.
Does it have any deeper meaning?
Not really.
Not really. Okay, well, that's great. I will contemplate it. Marvelous. Thank you. Folks, next week we're going to see you in the Sparrow's Nest, so we'll talk to you about some of the setup in there next week, and we'll talk more about the radical teaching of Jesus and the love of God. Thanks for listening. Say bye, Paul.
Bye.
All right, we're done.